We are taught that Japan's economic collapse in the 1990s was caused by a natural bubble bursting. We are told it was the inevitable result of overheated speculation and reckless lending, that the lost decades were a cautionary tale about letting markets run wild. But this is the version of history written to hide what really happened. The truth is that Japan's economy didn't collapse by accident. It was destroyed deliberately by an agreement signed in a hotel room in New York City in 1985, an agreement that Japan was forced to accept, an agreement that took the world's most competitive economy and turned it into a case study in stagnation. This is the story of the Plaza Accord, the deal that broke Japan, and the warning that China refuses to ignore. In 1985, Japan was unstoppable. Japanese cars were flooding American markets. Sony had just bought Columbia Pictures. Japanese investors were buying Rockefeller Center and Pebble Beach. The Nikkei stock index had quintupled in 5 years. Japanese companies dominated semiconductors, automobiles, consumer electronics, and machinery. American manufacturers were dying. Detroit was in crisis. The U.S. trade deficit with Japan had exploded from $10 billion in 1980 to $50 billion in 1985. Every month, more American factories closed. Every month, more American workers lost their jobs to Japanese competition. The American establishment looked at Japan and saw an existential threat, not a military threat, an economic one. For the first time since World War II, American economic dominance was being challenged, and the challenger was winning. But Japan had a vulnerability, a critical weakness that the United States could exploit. Japan's economy depended on exports, and exports depended on exchange rates. If the yen became too expensive, Japanese goods would become uncompetitive. Japanese growth would stop. The question was how to make that happen, how to force the yen to appreciate without Japan's consent, how to cripple Japan's economy while maintaining the appearance of cooperation. The answer was the Plaza Accord. On September 22, 1985, the finance ministers and central bank governors of 5 countries met at the Plaza Hotel in New York City, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, West Germany, and Japan. The meeting was presented as a multilateral effort to correct currency imbalances, a cooperative framework to stabilize the global economy. The official communiqué spoke of orderly appreciation of non-dollar currencies against the dollar. But the target was Japan, and everyone in that room knew it. The man who orchestrated the Plaza Accord was James Baker, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Treasury. Baker understood that the United States could not compete with Japan on manufacturing efficiency. American workers cost more, American factories were older, American companies moved slower, but the United States had something Japan didn't have: the world's reserve currency, the ability to pressure allies, and the willingness to use both. Baker's strategy was elegant. Instead of imposing tariffs or quotas, which would violate free trade principles and trigger retaliation, the United States would simply change the price of the yen, not through market forces, through coordinated intervention. The Plaza Accord committed the G5 nations to intervene in currency markets to drive down the dollar and drive up the yen. Central banks would sell dollars and buy yen, massively coordinated relentlessly. The mechanism was straightforward. The Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bundesbank, the Banque de France, and the Bank of Japan would simultaneously sell billions of dollars and buy yen, marks, and pounds. The sheer volume of coordinated selling would overwhelm market forces. Currency traders who bet against the intervention would be crushed. Within weeks of the Plaza Accord signing, the intervention began. Central banks sold $10 billion in the first month alone. Currency markets, which had been orderly, turned chaotic. The dollar plunged, the yen soared. Traders who had been short yen were wiped out. The financial press celebrated the Plaza Accord as a triumph of international cooperation. Economists praised it as evidence that coordinated policy could manage exchange rates without trade wars. The G5 ministers were lauded as wise statesmen preventing protectionism. But in Tokyo, the Ministry of Finance understood the reality. This was not cooperation. This was coercion dressed up as Japan had been given a choice between signing the Plaza Accord and facing congressional tariffs that would have been even more devastating. They chose the option that destroyed them slowly rather than immediately. Japan's Ministry of Finance resisted. They knew what would happen. A stronger yen would devastate exporters. It would trigger a recession. It would destroy the competitiveness that Japan had spent 40 years building. But they had no leverage. The United States controlled the reserve currency. The United States had the world's largest market. The United States could shut Japan out of the global economy if it chose to, but Japan had no choice. The alternative was worse. The United States made it clear that if Japan didn't cooperate, Congress would pass protectionist legislation, tariffs on Japanese cars, quotas on Japanese electronics, the dismantling of the free trade system that Japan's economy depended on. Japan was trapped. Agree to the Plaza Accord and face a slow strangulation, refuse and face immediate destruction. They chose the Plaza Accord. The results were immediate and catastrophic. In January 1985, before the Plaza Accord, the yen traded at 260 to the dollar. By the end of 1987, just 2 years later, it had appreciated to 122 the dollar. The yen had more than doubled in value. For Japanese exporters, this was a death sentence. A Toyota that cost $10,000 to produce in yen now cost $20,000 in dollar terms. Japanese electronics became unaffordable. Japanese machinery lost market share. The export engine that had driven Japan's miracle economy seized up. Japanese companies faced a choice: they could raise prices and lose market share, or they could cut costs and destroy profitability. Either way, they suffered. The Japanese government panicked. The Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan understood that if they did nothing, the economy would collapse into recession. Unemployment would rise, social stability would fracture. So they did what central banks always do in a crisis. They flooded the economy with cheap money. The Bank of Japan slashed interest rates from 5% in 1985 to 2.5% by 1987. Money became almost free. Credit exploded. Banks lent recklessly to anyone who asked. Corporations borrowed to buy real estate. Individuals borrowed to speculate in stocks. The Nikkei stock index, which had already been rising, went parabolic. From 13,000 in 1985 to 30,000 in 1989 to 38,916 at its peak in December 1989. In 4 years, the stock market tripled. Real estate prices followed the same trajectory. Land in Tokyo became the most expensive in the world. The grounds of the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo were said to be worth more than all the real estate in California. Golf club memberships sold for millions of dollars. A square meter of commercial property in Ginza cost more than an entire building in Manhattan. Japanese corporations went on a buying spree. Mitsubishi Estate bought Rockefeller Center in New York for $1.4 billion in 1989. Sony bought Columbia Pictures for $3 billion. Bridgestone bought Firestone Tire for $6 billion. Japanese investors bought Pebble Beach Golf Course, the Exxon building, and significant stakes in American companies across every industry. This was not just corporate ambition. This was an attempt to deploy capital abroad before the bubble burst at home. Japanese executives understood that real estate prices in Tokyo had become insane, but they couldn't say so publicly without triggering the crash. So they bought assets overseas, hoping to preserve value before the inevitable collapse. Individual Japanese citizens participated in the madness. Salarymen who had never invested before borrowed to buy stocks. Housewives speculated in real estate. Banks approved loans based on collateral values that existed only on paper. A modest apartment in Tokyo could be used as collateral for a loan worth millions of yen. The financial industry expanded wildly. Securities firms hired tens of thousands of workers. Banks opened branches in every neighborhood. Real estate agencies proliferated. Everyone was making money. Everyone believed the boom would last forever. But the mathematics were clear to anyone who looked. The Nikkei was trading at a price-to-earnings ratio of 60. Japanese real estate was valued at 4 times the entire real estate of the United States, despite Japan having a land area smaller than California. These numbers had no basis in economic fundamentals. This was pure speculation fueled by desperate monetary policy. This was not rational economic growth. This was a bubble, a massive, unsustainable bubble created by desperate monetary policy trying to offset the destruction caused by the Plaza Accord. Japanese banks understood the bubble was forming, but they couldn't stop lending. If they stopped, the economy would collapse immediately. If they continued, the collapse would come later. They chose later. By 1989, the bubble had become so extreme that even the Japanese government recognized it had to act. The Bank of Japan began raising interest rates from 2.5% in 1989 to 6% by 1990. The bubble popped. The Nikkei peaked at 38,916 on December 29, 1989. By October 1990, it had fallen to 20,000. By 1992, it was below 15,000. From peak to trough, the Nikkei lost 80% of its value. $2 trillion in market capitalization evaporated. Real estate followed. Property prices in Tokyo fell 70% from their peak. Golf club memberships that had sold for $3 million became worthless. Banks that had lent trillions of yen against real estate collateral found themselves holding loans that would never be repaid. The Japanese banking system was insolvent, not just weak, not just stressed, insolvent. The loans on their books were worth far less than the deposits they owed. If depositors had tried to withdraw their money all at once, the banks would have failed. But the Japanese government couldn't let the banks fail. A banking collapse would trigger a depression. So they did what governments always do. They lied. They told the public the banks were sound. They used accounting tricks to hide the losses. They created zombie banks, institutions that were technically alive but functionally dead, kept breathing by government life support. This was the beginning of Japan's lost decades. For the next 30 years, Japan's economy barely grew. GDP growth averaged less than 1% per year. Wages stagnated. Prices stagnated. The stock market never recovered its 1989 peak. Real estate never recovered its 1991 peak. An entire generation entered the workforce during a permanent recession. The human cost was staggering. College graduates in the 1990s and 2000s, the so-called lost generation, faced job markets where permanent employment had disappeared. Companies that once offered lifetime employment now hired only temporary workers. Starting salaries fell, benefits evaporated. Career advancement became impossible. Young people couldn't find good jobs. They couldn't afford to buy homes. They delayed marriage. They stopped having children. Japan's birth rate collapsed from 1.5 children per woman in 1992 to 1.26 by 2005. The population peaked in 2008 and began to shrink. By 2020, Japan had more people over 65 than under 15. The social fabric frayed, suicide rates spiked. The phenomenon of hikikomori, young people who withdrew from society entirely, became widespread. Hundreds of thousands of young men and women simply stopped participating in the economy. They lived with their parents. They didn't work. They didn't socialize. They existed in a state of permanent withdrawal. Deflation became entrenched. Prices fell year after year. Businesses couldn't raise prices. Workers couldn't demand higher wages. The Bank of Japan cut interest rates to zero, then below zero, but nothing worked. The economy was trapped in a deflationary spiral that no amount of monetary stimulus could break. This was not a natural economic cycle. This was not the result of Japanese policy mistakes. This was the direct consequence of the Plaza Accord. The currency appreciation forced by the United States destroyed Japan's export competitiveness. The resulting recession forced desperate monetary stimulus. The stimulus created an unsustainable bubble. The bubble burst and destroyed the financial system. The destroyed financial system paralyzed the economy for 3 decades. Every step of this process began with a meeting in the Plaza Hotel in September 1985. The United States achieved its objective. Japanese companies were no longer the unstoppable force they had been in 1985. American manufacturers regained market share. The U.S. trade deficit with Japan stabilized. Detroit survived, but the cost was paid by the Japanese people. An entire generation sacrificed their economic future because their government was forced to sign an agreement they knew would destroy them. The lesson was not lost on the rest of the world. Every developing economy that watched Japan's collapse learned the same thing. Never allow yourself to become so dependent on exports that a currency revaluation can destroy you. Never trust that free trade will remain free when you start winning. Never assume the United States will allow a rival to surpass it economically. And most importantly, never sign an agreement like the Plaza Accord. Today the pattern is repeating. But the target is not Japan, it is China. China has watched what happened to Japan. They studied the Plaza Accord. They analyzed every step of the process. They identified every mistake Japan made. And they are determined not to repeat them. When the United States demands that China revalue the yuan, China refuses. When the United States complains about the trade deficit, China buys U.S. treasuries but refuses to make concessions that would cripple its economy. When the United States threatens tariffs, China retaliates. China will not go to the Plaza Hotel. They will not sign an agreement to destroy their own economy. They remember what happened in Tokyo in the 1990s. So the United States has switched tactics. Since China won't cooperate voluntarily, the United States will use coercion, technology restrictions, semiconductor export controls, bans on Chinese companies, tariffs on Chinese goods, pressure on allies to decouple from Chinese supply chains. The goal is the same as it was in 1985. Cripple the rising economic power before it becomes too strong to contain. But the methods are different because China is not Japan. China is not a military ally dependent on American protection. China has nuclear weapons. China has its own market. China has options Japan never had. The conflict between the United States and China is not primarily about human rights or democracy or Taiwan. It is about the same thing the conflict with Japan was about. Economic dominance. The United States is the incumbent hegemon. China is the rising challenger, and history shows that incumbent hegemons do not surrender their position peacefully. The Plaza Accord was not an isolated event. It was a case study, a demonstration of what the United States is willing to do to maintain economic primacy. A blueprint that is being updated and reapplied today. The difference is that this time, the target knows what's coming, and they are not going to the Plaza Hotel. The semiconductor restrictions imposed on China in 2022 and 2023 are the modern equivalent of the Plaza Accord's currency intervention. They are designed to cripple China's most advanced industries, to prevent Chinese companies from accessing the technology they need to compete, to force China into a permanent position of technological inferiority. China's response has been to double down on self-sufficiency, to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in domestic semiconductor production, to create alternative supply chains that don't depend on American technology, to build a technological ecosystem that cannot be sanctioned, to accept short-term pain in exchange for long-term independence. This is the strategy Japan should have followed in 1985, but couldn't. Japan was too dependent on the American market and American protection. Japan had no alternative. China is not. The Belt and Road Initiative is China's insurance policy against a Plaza Accord scenario. If the United States tries to cut China off from Western markets, China will have alternative markets across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. If the dollar-based financial system becomes a weapon, China will have alternative payment systems. The digital yuan, China's central bank digital currency, is another defense. It creates a payment system that doesn't depend on SWIFT or the dollar. If the United States tries to use financial sanctions the way it used currency intervention in 1985, China will have a workaround. These are not the actions of a country that trusts the rules-based international order. These are the actions of a country that watched what happened to Japan and decided never to be that vulnerable. The tragedy of the Plaza Accord is not just what it did to Japan, it is what it revealed about the international system. The post-World War order was supposed to be based on rules and cooperation, free trade, stable currencies, multilateral institutions, but when Japan succeeded too well within that system, the rules changed. The United States used its position as the issuer of the reserve currency and the leader of the Western alliance to force Japan into an agreement that destroyed its economy. This sent a message to every other country in the world. The system is not actually rules-based, it is power-based, and the rules apply only as long as you are not winning too much. China received that message, so did every other developing economy with ambitions to grow. They learned that export-led growth has a ceiling. That ceiling is the point at which the United States perceives you as a threat. And when you reach that ceiling, the United States will use every tool available to push you back down. The tools have changed since 1985. Currency intervention has been supplemented by technology restrictions, financial sanctions, and supply chain warfare. But the objective remains the same: maintain American economic dominance, prevent any rival from reaching parity. The question is whether this strategy can work against China the way it worked against Japan. The answer is probably not. China is too large, too independent, too well prepared. The tactics that broke Japan in 1985 are unlikely to break China in 2025, but that does not mean the United States will stop trying. The conflict will escalate. The decoupling will accelerate. The world economy will fracture into competing blocks. Trade will become weaponized. Technology will become a battleground. Currency will become a tool of coercion. And at the center of all of it will be the lesson of the Plaza Accord: that cooperation between rivals is conditional, that agreements are only as durable as the power balance that created them, that economic systems are not neutral, they are designed to benefit those who control them. Japan learned this lesson too late. They signed the Plaza Accord believing that cooperation would be rewarded, that playing by the rules would protect them, that the United States valued Japan as an ally more than it feared Japan as a competitor. They were wrong, and they paid for that mistake with 30 years of stagnation. China will not make the same mistake. They will not cooperate in their own destruction. They will not sign an agreement like the Plaza Accord. They will resist, they will retaliate, they will build alternatives. And the world that emerges from that resistance will look nothing like the world of 1985. It will be a world of competing economic blocs, of rival currencies, of fragmented supply chains, of constant economic warfare. The Plaza Accord did not just break Japan's economy. It broke the illusion that the international economic system was designed for mutual benefit. It revealed that the system was designed to maintain American dominance, and anyone who threatened that dominance would be dealt with. Japan was dealt with in a hotel room in New York in 1985. The method was currency intervention. The result was the lost decades. China is being dealt with through technology restrictions and tariffs. The method is different, but the objective is the same. The only question is whether the outcome will be the same. Whether the United States can break China the way it broke Japan. Whether the tactics that worked in 1985 can work in 2025. The answer will determine the shape of the global economy for the next 50 years. But one thing is certain: the Plaza Accord was not a one-time event. It was a template, and that template is being used again today. The meeting that destroyed Japan happened on September 22, 1985. The meeting that will define China's fate is happening right now, not in a hotel, in a trade war, in technology restrictions, in financial decoupling. And China, unlike Japan, knows exactly what is at stake. This is Decoded Economics. Subscribe to see the future before it arrives.